So it's been 5 weeks since we ended our winter retreat, and it's interesting to me to notice that people are still talking about it, still doing BBCs about it, and still drawing insights from their retreat and using that to lead motivations in the hall. Um, and it seems to me it was a deep retreat for everyone, even for the participants doing retreat from afar who would be doing it probably for the first time. And I was I was wondering about that. Why was this retreat so different? There are probably many causes and conditions. I mean, even the flies in the meditation hall were quiet this year, weren't they? Usually they're zipping up and down, and but this year they were very still, very quiet. So as I thought about that, I thought I could come up with a few causes and conditions. The first one was Venerable had taught on the middle scope of the Lam Rim for 2 years prior to this retreat. So we had been very steeped in um, thinking about the first two Noble Truths, in particular, the 12 links, topics like that. Also, I really appreciate the Retreat from Afar materials that Venerable Lamsel pulled together from Volume 4 and also from the beautiful teachings that Venerable gave on the practice of the four establishments of mindfulness in 2011. That was very helpful to have those practices so clearly in front of us, at least for me. Also, some of us had done this retreat before. I had done it a couple times. Maybe some of you had done it once or twice as well. And also, this practice is very experiential, which lends to having a different kind of experience than, say, other things we might be meditating on. So I think that the four establishments of mindfulness are a very skillful way to understand our five aggregates, to really understand who we are as a person, our makeup, and also something more about the mechanism of cyclic existence itself. You know, how ignorance, for example, leads to feelings, pleasant, unpleasant feelings, which leads to different afflictions, different states of mind, and then actions and results like a rebirth. So I mentioned in the go around that it seemed that these meditations that we were doing, and there were so many different varied meditations, they naturally led the mind to a deeper understanding of renunciation, bodhicitta, and emptiness, the correct view. And I found it especially interesting in my own experience that the four establishments have a way of sneaking up on us and really introducing the mind to a sense of emptiness. So I didn't see anywhere in the Satipatthana Sutra any mention of clearly identifying the object of negation or the necessity of studying the four tenet schools or coming up with complicated syllogisms or pervasions. It was very straightforward, very experiential, wasn't it? And yet I would venture to say that each one of us were infused in our own way at whatever level we were meditating to have a greater awareness of dependent arising and emptiness because of these meditations, looking at the causes and conditions for the body, feelings, mind, and phenomena, and also reflecting on their impermanence, reflecting on the different parts, really analyzing, teasing them apart, their unsatisfying nature, etc. So that's the beauty of the four establishments, that they're not heavy on theory or philosophy, but through meditating on these four aspects, then we can directly confront self-grasping ignorance through our experiential understanding of causality and dependence on parts in particular. We also didn't have the support of, say, 10 or 12 or 14 hours of meditation as they may have in a Theravadan monastery when they're meditating on this topic. And as I reflected on that, because there is a way that concentration can carry the mind into some of those understandings. But the way I thought about this is that because there was a lack of that supportive concentration, I mean, we were doing mindfulness meditation, but not, again, not 10, 12, 14 hours a day. It required that, in my own experience, that I brought forth more logic and reasoning to try to understand the different meditations. So I thought this was kind of a middle way approach to working with the Satipatthana Sutra. In previous retreats on this topic, I couldn't quite reconcile some of the statements that I read by Bhikkhu Analayo, especially on how one develops insight into the selfless nature of reality simply by understanding the general characteristics of impermanence and unsatisfactoriness. Although I would have to say this, there were some glimpses. This was my experience in this retreat this winter. I was talking with Geshe-la about it just before, and I have to think about it some more. At the risk of taking his statement out of context or oversimplifying it, I just want to read a couple of paragraphs that seem to encapsulate how he was describing this practice and how impermanence in particular leads to this insight into the selfless nature. He says, according to the discourses, not seeing the arising and passing away of phenomena is simply ignorance, while to regard all phenomena as impermanent leads to knowledge and understanding. And from the Prasangika point of view, we can agree with that. Insight into the impermanence of the five aggregates or the six sense spheres is right view, and thereby leads directly on to realization. I'm not sure if he means realization of selflessness or realization of impermanence there, but he says, thus the direct experience of impermanence represents indeed the power aspect of meditative wisdom. These passages clearly show the central importance of developing a direct experience of the impermanent nature of all phenomena, as envisioned in this part of the Satipatthana refrain. So he's commenting on the refrain in this section. The same is reflected in the commentarial scheme of the insight knowledges, which details key experiences to be encountered during the path to realization. The other two characteristics of conditioned existence, dukkha or unsatisfactoriness, and absence of a self, become evident as a consequence of a direct experience and thereby realistic appreciation of the truth of impermanence. The discourses frequently point to this relationship between the three characteristics by presenting a progressive pattern that leads from awareness of impermanence to acknowledging the unsatisfactory nature of what is impermanent, to appreciating the selfless nature of what is unsatisfactory. So initially I found that very confusing, coming from being steeped in Prasangika explanations of emptiness. But in my own experience this winter of meditating on the body is pretty straightforward, thinking about the 32 aspects, the impermanent nature of those 32 aspects, the different causes and conditions of them, thinking about their parts, taking them apart and looking at the parts. Really lended itself to understanding more of the dependent nature of the body. But by systematically going through the various causes and results of feelings, mind, and mental factors, and looking closely at their nature and their function, then that dependent nature of the mind, which being non-material is more difficult to understand, slowly began to come into focus. Also, early on in the retreat, we also had the support of Geshe Tapke teaching on the Rice Seedling Sutra and talking a lot about dependent arising. So it was difficult to tease apart what's coming just from the meditations on the cushion and what's coming from all these different teachings that we were getting during the retreat. But there was one section of the Rice Seedling Sutra that really stuck with me. And again, I know it's a little difficult to read these and really take them in, but I'll just read it slowly. He says, thus the term dependent arising applies to all phenomena because all phenomena are dependent on their basis of imputation, their parts, causes, and so forth, and then are established as an object of the mind in relation to that basis of imputation and independence on imputing terms and concepts. For some reason, that just stood out so clearly, like there is a basis of designation and there is this imputing mind. Both parts are necessary. It almost sounded like a Svatantrika explanation, except that the parts are not inherently existent. In other words, it refers to phenomena of being dependent on their parts and so forth, being apprehended as a basis of imputation, and then being established in dependence upon imputation by terms and concepts. So when I read this and put it together with some of the meditations that I was doing, it seemed like this is what we were doing in the meditations. We were looking at the basis of imputation. We were apprehending the basis of imputation. And then we had the possibility of noticing the imputing mind, or the concepts that we bring to that whole combination of things that we're doing. So this analysis is so much easier with something like a chariot. And to some degree, we can say it's kind of easy with the body because there's something physical that we can look at, and even the parts underneath the skin, we can look at anatomical pictures, or we can look at Boney, our new Abbey resident, the skeleton, or different things like this. The mind is not being non-physical, is more elusive, in our meditations. And yet the Satipatthana practice gives us three different chances to look at it: through feelings, through mind, and then through phenomena, mostly the mental factors. So I'll bet all of us had moments of discomfort when our meditations were going well. And yet the foundation underneath us began to quiver a little bit. The rug was being pulled by really analyzing these different aspects of the body and the mind. We may have felt uneasy as these meditations began to undermine the grasping that has defined us and the world around us. And I was, as Venerable Chuni described in one of her early BBCs during the retreat, she said this can lead to a feeling of disillusionment because the self that we have clung to and the world around us don't turn out to be what we thought they were. But it's this very disillusionment that will lead us to aspiring for liberation and full awakening. It's interesting. In this retreat, I didn't feel disillusioned. Maybe I failed. I didn't feel disillusioned. I felt elated to have these discoveries. I felt very energized and encouraged. Now, I'm a long way off from any realization of emptiness. I know that for a fact. But I felt encouraged because there were moments of clarity, and I bet you had them too. There were moments of clarity and deeper understanding that the body is merely imputed and impersonal. The mind is merely imputed and impersonal. And therefore, the self too is merely imputed and impersonal. Yeah, it's hard to describe these experiences. Just small moments of clarity, of understanding that, really understanding that for the moment. So no wonder Tsongkhapa called dependent arising the monarch of reasoning, looking at causes and conditions, looking at parts, and using that as a basis for moving our mind to a deeper understanding of realizing the most subtle level of dependent arising, which is being dependent on imputation and concept. So I intend to continue familiarizing my mind by examining causes and conditions of people and things, and examining their parts, trying to remember not to be lazy, but to continue examining, analyzing. It takes concerted effort, I find, to do those kinds of analyses, and then trying to see how they're labeled independence on their basis of designation and imputing mind. So I really appreciate that we had another opportunity to do retreat on the four establishments of mindfulness. And I hope we get to do it again. And of course, we can continue doing this even in between retreats.